Sean, can I ask you if you think that whether the Palestine conflict is linked with the Syria one directly, or do you think there's an indirect connection?
Well, there's a bit of both, in that there's an indirect connection in that Israel uses the Syria issue, for example, to scare its own people into supporting various policies. Like one of the things they always talked about when, well, they still talk about when talking about the need for a blockade on Gaza, is they love talking about the threats from abroad. They say, you know, our neighbors aren't as friendly as we are. They love making that point, don't they? Like, oh, you know, if we take our foot off the gas, then we're opening the door for a group like the Daesh or al-Nusra to get a foothold in places like Gaza or the West.
Exceptionalism argument, like we're the only democracy in the Middle East, we're the only beacon of stability and all this.
Yeah, we're the only people that don't have native terrorism, like large terrorist groups, or I don't know what their argument is, to be honest, but it's very vague, and that's probably by design. But in terms of a more direct connection, well, we know because there is a kind of an aggressive nationalistic government in Israel, they can be quite interventionist with neighboring conflicts. We know how, and I would love, and there's so much you can read about this. I would say there are people I'd point you toward who know much more about this than I do, but we know how they've intervened in Lebanon over the decades, how they are now intervening in Syria and are bombing various key facilities. And yeah, they do intervene. They're interventionist. They're interventionist, aren't they?
So, Michael, have you come across this argument about Israeli? I can guess it's quite common in America, this whole argument that Israel is unique and holds a unique position in the Middle East because it's a democracy and so forth. Do you come across this a lot in the various groups that you moderate?
Yeah, well, this is what's interesting. I was, the day I joined Facebook, I was sort of apolitical. People had asked me to join Facebook for years, and I joined Facebook the day after Trump was elected, actually inaugurated. And the reason for that is I saw the insidious, I guess, the influence of the American evangelicals. Now, it's hard for you as non-Americans to understand the influence of the Christian, I call them the Christian Taliban.
Well, actually, Neiman, Michael, I'm very interested in this subject, and for a while, I don't know if Oz told you this, but I only converted to kind of Sufi Islam in later life. But during my teenage years, I was quite active in what you could call the New Atheist movement, and I'm a bit obviously rather disillusioned with it now. But one of the very sensible things they talked about was the massive threat in the US. We looked at it. It was quite scary for me, and I think for any observer, when you look at the influence of the Christian right over there, you don't really have any. We have our own problems over here, of course, but yeah, they're scary. I'm with you.
So what we see here is Christian Zionism. I'm not sure if that's a term you're familiar with.
Yes.
Sean, in your, but we see Israel as doing no wrong. Most of the outlets are neutral, like the more conservative outlets. It's funny, they're anti-Semitic, but they're pro-Israel.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. They hate Jews, but they love Israel.
Yeah, we were looking at a statistic in politics, and it was more Christians, evangelical Christians, that were like pro-Israel than Jews were, and there was like a higher percentage of them that were pro-Israel, even though they were a bit anti-Semitic as well. So it was really interesting.
Well, that's the thing. They say we don't mind Jews as long as they stay where they're supposed to be, right? That's the idea that they have to.
They basically see the Israeli government as a pawn in their passion play, right? Because when the Messiah comes and the rapture comes, it's going to be in Israel. So they basically see they're basically playing Netanyahu as a fool, as a dupe for their greater good. They don't,
I think they're willing dupes because they're both religious extremists, aren't they? Really. We should obviously not stay on this topic for too long, because I don't want to go. But just Syria is a very worthy topic too. We've discussed Israel a few times, even actually. But we, you're right. It's their passion play. But for the religious fundamentalists also running Israel, really, they think the Messiah is going to come and he's going to make everyone either is going to make everyone Jewish or, but I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can interpret it, but that's not the point. The point is they don't think that there's a consequence for their aggressive actions. I mean, this is the thing. When you're dealing with rational agents, you hope that most rational agents, that they fundamentally want peace, right? Like when you're negotiating, that's kind of one of the bases of diplomacy, in that you're all rational agents. You all want a more peaceful world, and but they think they're trying to bring about the next world, and whenever you're dealing with people like that, they can be quite dangerous.
Sorry, Sean, to interrupt. I noticed Nazim is on the call, and Michael, I think it's useful for you to meet Nazim because he also works in religious dialogue as well. So he does a lot of like Zoom calls as well with atheists, and
I think we're Facebook friends. Hi, Nazim.
Oh, hi, Michael. Hi.
Nazim, are you a social worker?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I support adults with autism.
Yes, you and I are Facebook friends. Good to talk with you.
Oh, you too as well. And Assalamualaikum, brother Sean and Osama and everyone else.
Walaikum salam.
Hi. Sorry, my camera's not working on my laptop, so I'll try logging onto a different device.
No problem. Take your time. It's fine. So, Sean, it's interesting what you were saying. Obviously, we do need to steer the discussion back to Syria, but in terms of the role that Christian Zionists have had on Israel, it's actually, I think Israel has militarized and expanded more aggressively under a Christian political operation. For example, if you look at the role George Bush has had, Donald Trump, AIPAC in the US, even the Labour Party in the UK, when essentially they signed Israel's inception, I get the impression that Christian fundamentalists use Israel as a means to an end to achieve their objective, which is to have a base or a platform or a springboard for Judeo-Christian values in the Middle East.
Well, this is the debate we had the other week, didn't we? It was about is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail and all this stuff. And it's like, the problem with this analogy is it's very easy to say both, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. They in a mutually beneficial, but in a very toxic way, kind of relationship, where the government in Israel will push certain propaganda within the US. They obviously, as you know, Michael, have a very powerful lobby, AIPAC and the rest of it. But at the same time, the Christian extremists that kind of rise to the top of the GOP, the Republicans, they provide Israel with the diplomatic and military cover for their endeavors. Right? Like they apologize for Israel around the world, or even you could say propagandize for Israel around the world, talking about, it's quite fascinating actually when you look at, we supposedly live in quite an atheistic age and a very secular time, even
we live in a secular age.
Yeah,
I don't think we live in an
50
atheist.
years even, there's been a lot of change. But I ask you to think about any other time in international relations where a power will justify what another power is doing, or any of those kinds of things on explicitly religious terms. We still hear people talking about how Israel is the Jews' God-given land. It's their biblical homeland. How many other times do they talk about the Bible in serious diplomatic dialogue? You'd get laughed out of the room if you were saying, we have to be very kind to Saudi Arabia and have really close relationships with them because they are the home of the holy masjids. And could you ever imagine our leaders talking like that?
There is one time I can think of, that might be in ancient Greece, whenever Athens aligned with Sparta against the Persians because of their shared cult. But that's just
now. Like there's a lot of that kind of justification going on in the past, but now, I mean, you hear it in India, perhaps, with regard to Kashmir, like the Indians say that it is our holy birthright, again, because they believe the various planets.
True. You're right. But, okay, here's another thing. And this steers us back to the Syria discussion. Arab leaders use the Israeli issue as well. And they're very good at using that to consolidate power and authoritarianism. Because if you look at Gaddafi, if you look at Bashar al-Assad, if you look at Saddam Hussein, they all had the same thing in common, which is that part of their justification for their actions was the fact that they oppose Israel. Vladimir Putin does the same thing. And people fall for it. A lot of people watch Russia Today, they watch Al Jazeera, they see Putin as the strong man riding the horse that's counter-Israel, and they think, oh great, he's going to solve all our problems, let's vote for him. But if you're going to look at Putin from the perspective of a Muslim, right, he is still bombing Chechens and Dagestanis who are Muslim. So he's clearly somebody that is using the Israel issue to consolidate consensus. And Bashar al-Assad is exactly the same. Do you think Bashar al-Assad really gives a shit about Gazans or Western people in the West? He doesn't care. What he cares about is not getting ousted and not being sent to the death penalty. That's the bottom line.
If Oz, the religious right in West Asia, use it for the exact same reason as we've been talking about. They see, you know, like the Islamic Front in Gaza or Hamas even. There are sections of Hamas, we've all seen their original charter. They believe that they are part of some cosmic struggle, and people use Israel, even people who are opposed to the Israeli government. You wonder how much of it is based on a sincere interest in human rights, and how much of it is they believe that by fighting the Israeli government and the quote unquote Zionists, when really these people, when they say Zionists, they just mean Jews, right? They are saying they believe it's part of some cosmic struggle, that they are going to bring about the rapture. But the Muslim version, I mean, we all believe it's a part of our faith. We believe in the day of judgment and everything else. And there are many ways you can interpret it, but I don't believe that we can bring about the day of judgment by being warmongers. I think it's a great way to be on the wrong side of it. It's a quick ticket to hell, but you know,
that's an interesting distinction between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is that Al-Qaeda always modeled themselves as preparing for the day of judgment. They're trying to do stuff because they're anticipating the Mahdi coming or anticipating the apocalypse. But ISIS tried to create the apocalypse, and they tried to say, we're in it and we need the caliphate now, and you guys need to come and fight for us because this is the end of times, right? But you know, there are a lot of, I've noticed this, I'm not sure, Michael, if you know more about this, but I have seen this distinction amongst Zionists as well. There are Zionists that believe we're in the apocalypse, and there are Zionists that are preparing for it. Have you come across this yourself?
Well, from what I know, and I've got a question for you, Sean, and maybe Nizam and anyone else after I respond to that, if it's okay. To me, it's ironic because the Israeli citizens that believe in, you know, the rapture don't believe that the Jewish state should exist. These are like ultra-Orthodox Jews that really don't believe in Israel per se. They're citizens, they don't serve in the army, right? They're sort of internal resistors. Yeah. And that's the ironic thing to me about the ones in Israel who resist. But when I think about the Arab countries or the Muslim countries that recognize Israel, it's Turkey, it's Jordan, Egypt was the original one, and I think Saudi Arabia is going in that direction. They're going to, at least they've informally recognized it. Aren't they using Israel in a sense against the Shia countries, almost like saying, you know, we prefer to support Israel against Iran or, you know, Hezbollah. I'm just throwing that out there. Yeah. If there's also some using of Israel in the Muslim world.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I can see that happening. I think that's a really good theory. I think they're definitely doing that, especially Saudi Arabia, because they don't like Iran. Israel doesn't like Iran, so they've sort of gone with Israel for like political reasons.
Yes, it's a very common sense observation. It's very just, you look at it and you see it, and I don't think you can come to any other conclusion that other than Saudi hates Iran so much, or his government, however you want to phrase it, the Shia, that they are happy to use any weapon against them that they can, and they know the main enemy of Iran is Israel in the region. But then you wonder how much it's really an enemy, to the extent that the regressive, this is the really tragic thing about international politics, is that the most regressive forces in various countries have a kind of symbiotic relationship with each other. Like I've read a lot about this. There are so many examples where the intellectual justification that Israel uses for its kind of aggression is based on the kind of extremists that they perceive abroad. But then Iran, the extremists within Iran, use the threat of Israel and the US to keep themselves in power as well. And it's the only interesting question is, how do you break that cycle? That's what the question lies. But with regard to your first point about the conscientious objectors, like the ultra-Orthodox, then Haredi, we've got to be careful not to overstate their section of the Jews that they represent, because they do exist. Like, you have groups like Neturei Karta, who are, like you say, they don't believe that Israel should exist. They think that the Messiah is the only one with the right to declare Israel, and so on and so on. But they actually only represent a very small number of Ashkenazi Jews. There are a lot of Jews, is what I'm trying to say, who occupy a sort of middle ground, where they think you can have Israel or a large number of Jews congregating in what we call Israel, but there are certain things about the modern state of Israel that they would say is secular, but they would use it as a slur, as a lot of people do from any kind of the right wing of any religious community. And you can see that, or they would say it's just not biblical, that the current state of Israel has no resemblance to its biblical analog, in that, for example, I don't know if you guys know this, always found this really fascinating, but the biblical state of Israel, you can check this, didn't have a standing army. God said it wasn't permitted. One of the things that he forbade for Israel was having a standing army. So you can have reservists. He said, because when you're not at war, I believe it is incumbent upon you to live lives of peace, to go and to till the fields and grow crops for your family and all that stuff, right? So when they have a standing army, they're already doing something that the biblical Israel wouldn't have done. You can find loads of examples like this. So it's very interesting. But then Israel, when it depends who they're talking to, I mean, Muslims get accused of this all the time, right? I don't know if you've heard this, Oz, but it's a common Islamophobic trope that when Muslim intellectuals come and talk and they're very liberal or just progressive, or I would just say even represent the mainstream of the Muslim body, the Islamophobic crowd will come in and say, but what would you say in Arabic? What would you say to your Muslims when you're talking amongst yourselves? So you're engaging in taqiyya,
Yeah.
We say similar things to you do hear some of that with regard to Israel, where people saying, but what are you saying in Hebrew? Like, when you're talking to other Jews and to other devout Jews, are you using the same secular terms that you use to justify yourself to the West? Because one of the ways that they'll talk about how they're the only democracy in the Middle East is in terms of how secular they are. It's very pick and choose. Like, they will talk about how secular and progressive they are on the one hand, but then use their biblical identity or supposed biblical identity to justify their existence on the other hand. Right? Have you guys ever noticed that contradiction?
No, I haven't noticed it.
But I just always thought it was very bizarre. And it's amazing that the world falls for it. But, yeah.
Agreed. No, I agree. One thing I wanted to look at and I wanted to discuss was this, which is about ISIS foreign fighters, the different nationalities that have joined ISIS. So, as you can see, the most is Russian, then Saudi, then Jordanian, Tunisian, French, Moroccan. It's interesting that more Russian and French nationals have joined than Turkish, but I suspect that's because of the amount of migrant communities in France, for example. Now, do you think that there was what role do you guys think there is for a crisis in identity or in faith, in basically do you think ISIS came at a time where they knew that a lot of young Muslims were disenfranchised and they took advantage of that? Because this is the impression I get when I read these statistics.
I'm just waiting for someone else to talk. I've had my turn.
What do you think, Nazim?
Sorry, what was the question again?
The question is, do you think, obviously because of these statistics, which suggest that you can see a lot of, these are the nationalities of foreign fighters that joined ISIS. especially during the war in Syria and Iraq, because ML, I want to make this point to you actually for your studies. ISIS did exist before the war in Syria. I think actually since roughly about 2003. So they have always been in the area, but they kind of came to light during the Syria war. Now you can see that, for example, Russia and France has a high North African and Turkish demographic. So do you think that the reason that they've managed to consolidate so many Muslims that live abroad is because they took advantage of the identity crisis that young Muslims have living in countries like England and France and whatnot?
So are you saying that many of these fighters may be like ex-Chechnya rebels?
They could be, yeah. In Russia's case, they could be. But I think in the French case and the British case, they're people like me and you, basically. So the question is, what would make someone like me and you become a radical and join ISIS?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess a lot of it may start out from having like a fundamentalist ideology, and just basically being brainwashed and conditioned and almost made to feel like like there's nothing else that you can do other than just simply go out and join these militant fighters or extremist groups, and you're made to feel guilty as well, that if you do not support them, then there's something defective in your Islam. And also these kind of slogans get thrown around as well, like liberal and modernist. So if you oppose like their ideology, then you're seen as either a modernist, and that's to put it nicely, or at work best, they make takfir on you. They see you as a double agent, or they don't consider your Islam to be authentic. And a lot of it's to do with the people that you socialize with, the people that you listen, and you're also made to remain ignorant. Basically, you're basically programmed to not to listen to others like scholars or speakers, as well as to research for yourself or to read other books. But you're kind of like put in this type of gang or group where the only source of knowledge that you're getting is from whoever is in charge or is leading that group.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated.
Do you get those whenever you engage in like moderate discourse? Have you ever had the accusation that you're a kafir, or you're somebody that's kind of colonized in the mind, whatever? Has anyone said that to you?
Probably they have, but I just don't keep a record of all the the labels and takfir that come my way. And also these days I'm kind of like desensitized to it all, that I just don't let it get to me. But also a lot of the time it's not me, but I see it being done on others. Where others get this label attached to them as being a liberal or modernist, but then later on, like, you find out for yourself when you get exposed, to other viewpoints, you'll see that how much misled you were. And I even asked myself, like, what type of conversation I would have with myself, like, say, if the Nazim of 20 years ago met me now. I even wonder if the Nazim of 20 years ago would, regard me as a moderate Muslim. Because I think many of us have gone through this phase where when we initially start practicing Islam, we start out being very literal in our understanding, and Puritan. But then later on, like when we get exposed to like other points of views, we see that Islam is much broader than what we initially thought it was, or what we were taught to believe.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think you've touched upon three really crucial things here. The first is that instability at home can leave children vulnerable to radical groups. And I think people need to, whenever counter-extremism or counter-extremism research is done, either in the context of Syria or anywhere else, policymakers need to address counter-extremism in the same way that they address grooming gangs and pedophiles. These are literally people that take advantage of vulnerable young individuals that have insecurities, that have fragile backgrounds, or may have had trauma in their life, right? This is the first point. The second point is, you mentioned that they have a fundamental background. And I think that's, I would substitute the word fundamental for binary. I think it's really important that if you look at a lot of ISIS commanders, and you look at their, for example, Abu Bakr Baghdadi did his doctorate in Islamic studies. He was kind of an exception to the rule, but there are a lot of them that have doctorates.
Well, sorry to cut. Well, his PhD was actually in Tajweed. This is what many people mistake. It wasn't actually like in Islamic theology or in Quranic exegesis or in Islamic law Sharia, but it was on Tajweed, which is basically how to recite the Quran.
Like proper recitation, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know. Interesting. I didn't know that.
It's I think you're right to point out the fact that this fundamentalist brand of Islam is actually very binary. I think these are maybe the terms that we should start speaking in, because a lot of people reject the label of fundamentalist as having an inherently kind of secular framing, because we're implying that people who take their faith seriously, who believe in its fundamentals, are somehow the problem, right? It's often the people who have a very warped or very narrow interpretation of faith who are actually the issue. And I think the term that a lot of devout Muslims would probably use instead of fundamentalist is sectarian. I think that's why I like to use, I'm trying to change my language, edit my language so that I use the word sectarian more. Because there are other terms, but that's quite a good one, in that those people, like, that's what my brothers are very bad. One's a Hafiz, which Michael means that he's memorized the entire Quran. And the other one is a part-time imam. And they always say that they're quite strict Islamists, very devout, but they say, but they accept that there can be legitimate scholarly disagreement within Islam on many issues, as I'm sure Nazim and Oz would wholeheartedly back here. On so many issues of Sharia and of Islamic law, there is a wide spectrum of just accepted scholarly opinion. You have the majority opinion within the four madhabs, because then again, you could have an opinion which is only a majority opinion in one madhab, but it's considered kind of mainstream or acceptable. You have the four in Sunni Islam, the four main Sunni madhab. You have four main madhabs, schools of thought, and within each of those, you have the kind of majority and minority opinions, but they're considered valid opinions because they're held by a significant enough minority of scholars for them to be taken seriously, right? And but then even outside of that, you have what people call strange opinions. Like you might have the case of a stray scholar who is a very serious scholar, but he is considered a very isolated case and holding a certain opinion on something. Yeah. But a lot of people say, well, even that, we should, we'll let it pass, kind of thing. But the sectarians they'll say that this is our view, very, very narrow view of Islam, and then they say everything else is, as Nizam says, they'll declare takfir, which is to declare them hypocrites or whatever, and to put them outside of the fold. Michael, it's the same as excommunication, basically. Takfir is the Islamic version of excommunication, but it wasn't as institutionalized as you saw in the Catholic Church. Whereas religion, Islam is a lot less institutional than the Catholic Church, but it could be declared by individual scholars against other Muslims, and can be quite grassroots, actually. You can see people declaring takfir left, right, center. And there are major scholars that went through the kind of transformation that Nazim's talking about. And it's very interesting. I wish I had more time on my hands. Time is a very precious commodity when you're a young parent. But when I have managed to listen to some of Yasser Qadhi's longer podcasts, Yasser Qadhi is a major Islamic scholar, and he is considered like the bread and butter scholar of the US for a while, wasn't he? And he said he studied in Saudi with the Salafis and like the ultra Salafis. And he said the main thing that he remembers, which kind of pushed him out of that bubble, was what he kind of described as the sectarianism. Was, you know, they have their opinion, but it's how willing that they are to take their opinion and say that there is no other legitimate opinion. And he said that's the kind of thing. He said it wasn't justified from the perspective of the text, and you can see it in some things that have creeped into the Islamic mainstream. Like I would say around music.
Wrap up your point, Sean, because I want to come back at something.
Yeah, I'll wrap up my point, but I'll just end it with this. Music is one that really grinds my gears and is a classic example, because you can say that it is, I don't know if you know this, Michael, but there are a lot of Muslims that say that instruments are completely haram. Like you can't make music with instruments. And they will say, oh, it's haram, just haram, full stop. But actually, and I have various articles kind of bookmarked to this effect, there are a significant number of scholars, a clear minority within multiple madhabs, including al-Ghazali himself, which is like almost like a Thomas Aquinas of Islam. Who said that instrumental music was permissible, not necessarily recommended, but permissible. But yet the amount of time that you see people pushing this absurd opinion that music is totally haram, it just blows my mind.
So there's a leadership issue here, which we need to talk about, right? But the way I see it, the problem has always been there. What is the problem? It's vulnerability and insecurity, because the Muslim community has a unique situation whereby a large proportion of its youth are migrant individuals that live in other countries in Europe or in America or whatever, right? So that's what differentiates the Muslim community in general from the Christian community, amongst other things, okay? Now, the vulnerability has always been there, and you can see how the vulnerability has been exploited over time, even before Syria. You know, even in a non-radical or terroristic framework, just crime amongst youths, or how youths end up being drug dealers, or whatever it is. But when Syria came, the right petri dish at the right temperature emerged, and then the bacteria grew out of control, right? So now, one of the issues that I think we have is lack of, as well as instability in our communities, and an identity crisis that is caused by migration, we also have lack of diversity in thought, which is why I put up this integrative complexity thing. All backgrounds, all expertise are useful, but the problem that we have, and you look at a lot of the leaders in radical groups like ISIS, a lot of the leaders are qualified in science and positivist subjects, mathematics, engineering, subjects that require 1 or 0 binary thinking, which is useful. It can make you a decisive individual, but it doesn't nurture integrative complexity, which is the ability to handle nuance and different ideas at the same time, which is the antithesis to radicalisation, right? So I think we also need to be making sure that our children are in they're in a wide variety of subjects and having different influences from different fields. I think this is very important.
Yeah, and you're right to point out, it's the character, again, people have been writing in the chat section that this or that is characteristic of any cult, but that is definitely, I think, essential to any cult, is to take advantage of people's insecurities and their
so the question now is leadership, is a centralized leadership like the way that Christians or Catholics have with the Pope, in the Islamic case, would that present solutions to issues like ISIS in Syria, or would this create more problems? If there was one person, like if everything was centralized.
I don't know, because it would always be susceptible to manipulation. But I want to speak to a point about the instrumentalization, or the instrumentalization of these groups. I don't know if you guys have touched upon it, but the way if we speak about or think about the Operation Gladio, for example, as a kind of starting point. Operation Gladio is now well known and attested to NATO stay behind operations that were geared towards creating this state of tension, or proper term? Yeah, strategy of tension. Now, the way in which this was done, most famously in Italy, was through the use of paramilitary groups and terrorist actions in Italy in the 70s and 80s, I believe, which was blamed then on left-wing groups, right? But we now know, obviously, that it wasn't that. It wasn't these left-wing groups that were doing it in the majority, or in most cases. In reality, it was NATO stay behind operations in order to get the burgeoning popularity of these left-wing organizations and left-wing groups across Europe out of the picture, out of the mainstream, basically. And it was done across Europe, Belgium, Italy. So these, basically, why I start off with Operation Gladio is because these groups, these paramilitary groups, were used as tools for NATO expansionism, basically. That's the long and short of it. Now, what I'm saying is, I'm drawing a direct connection between that and the use of non-state actors in Libya, Syria, Iraq, wherever. I think you should pull up the map by Colonel Ralph Peters, Blood Borders, it's called. Blood Borders, Colonel Ralph Peters. He famously, in the War College, presented a map of a redrawn map of the Middle East. And it showed the various Arab states that would be split up. This was in early 2000s. This was before any engagement, any battle engagement. Definitely before Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. And from Blood Borders, we move on to it kind of indicates that there were plans to cut up Syria, cut up Iraq, cut up Libya. And the more updated map is by Robin Wright, the famous journalist of the Sunday, I think it was Sunday Times. I might be mistaken on that. But Robert Wright, he's got a map called A New Middle East, and that also kind of draws upon the Blood Borders map, but it's kind of updated. So it shows on what possibilities, how these state structures in the Middle East and the Arab world, how they could possibly change, how the borders could change. Now, what I'm saying is, okay, this is all well and good. These are deliberations by military-minded people, kind of seeing how things on the ground may change realities on a state level, on a state structure level. But what I would always ask is of course, cui bono? In whose interest is it? In whose interest does it serve that the surrounding Arab nations or the Arab world in general is divided and split asunder and balkanized? The argument, my answer would be, just so I'm not coy with it, the answer would be Israel. Israel stands to benefit from this kind of destabilization campaign, from this balkanization campaign. Now, to draw the connection before and let other people come in, because I do have more to say on this. The connection between Gladio and these modern day kind of paramilitary groups, non-state actors, is that they are also today, just like in Operation Gladio, they are being used today to further the ends of other than their own. I mean, we all are in agreement that it's not to the benefit of any of these Arab countries, what these non-state actors are doing and committing in terms of atrocity. So of course, we kind of, well, I'm interested in the instrumentalization, and what I would argue is that before any engagement in the Arab world in the 90s, of course, the kind of base, the operation for hardline extremists, for jihadists, was London. That's why London was called Londonistan. And this isn't my words, by the way, in terms of London being a base. I point towards Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, famous strategist of Al-Qaeda, notorious. He's Syrian as well, so he's very relevant here, Abu Mus'ab al-Suri. He arguably created the strategy of tension with Islamic Garb in his famous tract. I can't remember the name of the book that he wrote. That was it, Call for a Global Islamic Resistance, right? He advocated Islamic terms, the same strategy of tension that we saw in Operation Gladio, right? So you would provoke the authorities through civil disobedience or through outright military attacks, and that would cause the state, of course, to come down hard, and that would create some type of sympathy for your group, right? And this is all, as I say, it's a strategy that he's took the time to write up, and he's published it, and it's available on the internet. Now, Abu Musab al-Suri is famously, he was close to bin Laden. He was out there in Afghanistan. He was also, arguably, it took part in the attempted coup in 1984 in Syria. But the point about Londonistan, just to finish off with that point, and then I will stop, that he's the one who said that that London was the place to be in the 90s if you were an Islamist. It was the place to be. There were numerous publication houses. There was numerous famous preachers, hardline Islamist preachers in London, based in London. And he was like, yeah, this is the place to be. And he actually moved to London in the 90s. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Zerb. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, just a quick question. When you were, just to clarify something you said, when you asked who had to benefit from this kind of balkanization, which is a good word for it, balkanization of the region, did you mean that kind of the primary beneficiary in terms of a local state actor would be Israel? In which case I would totally agree with you. I would only add that you have to look at sort of various corporate, sorry, my baby's crying in the background. I hope that isn't too noisy for you guys. My wife's the main corporate, there are major corporate beneficiaries, and the military industrial complex of various complexes of various Western powers, whether it be the US, the UK, who would all benefit from the balkanization of them. I mean, look at Halliburton's, Dick Cheney's company, and however many billions it was that he earned out of the Iraq invasion. And there are even, I would argue, plutocratic or capitalistic interests, if you want to be a bit more abstract about it, within that region who benefit from this. And that, if you look at some of the Arab rulers that people rightly label as kind of pawns of the West, I think that their family, their dynasties, some of them have got very, very rich off their complicity with kind of Western aggression. That's all I would add to that.
But I just wanted, just while we're on the topic of divide and conquer and how it's catalyzed the Syria issue, I want to make a really important point, mainly for Emma, for her studies, is that a lot of people talk about Sykes-Picot as being the instance where the West began to divide the Ottoman Empire into new countries. But it's not Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot was the discussion. The actual treaty that divided the Middle East was the Treaty of Sevres. So if you ever write about this in one of your essays, don't write Sykes-Picot, write Treaty of Sevres. So my question then is, let's say that post-colonial division is the cause of a lot of our problems and a lot of our instabilities in the Middle East. Therefore, how responsible are we as Arabs for not managing the problem or not managing the division accordingly and appropriately, and actually raising to the bait and falling into the bait of having conflicts with one another? Is there an element of responsibility there from our side?
Of course there is, but the question is this a new phenomenon, or is it a unique phenomenon for the Arab world? Because obviously, I mean, the answer to the question, militancy, extremism is not a uniquely Arab problem, is it? We know, we only need to mention the French Revolution, the French Terror, the notorious terror of the French Revolution, to kind of illustrate the point that humans are susceptible especially when they are beguiled by romantic notions and ideals, to commit excesses. And I think in that way, there's a similarity that, much like the French revolutionaries who committed the terror, it's secular. That's the secular form, is what I'm saying. They excommunicated, quote unquote, right? Everyone who was seen to be anti-revolutionary. Do you see what I'm saying? So in the same way, these extremists today will excommunicate, quote unquote, even though there isn't a centralized body, but they will excommunicate and execute anyone who's seen to be anti-Islamic, right? So what I'm saying is that these things are existent, and what it needs is the instrumentalization. There needs to be a trigger, is my point. So of course there is responsibility, but the trigger is what I'm interested in, because but for, again, if we ask like a legal question, but for the intervention, or but for the support for these groups in Afghanistan, for these groups in, do you see what I'm saying? Like, you see where I'm going with this? But for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, would bin Laden have gained the traction that he gained in the wider world? But for the support through the CIA and the Pakistani ISI and the Israel, right? That's the other part that's not really spoken about when it comes to Afghanistan, and the support of the West for the quote unquote mujahideen at that point, right? But for their support of those groups, would they have been able to have global reach like they have today? I don't know.
So can I just see if I understood your argument? So you're saying more interesting than the fact that there are extremist ideologies native to the region, but because there are indeed extremist ways of thinking present in any kind of region or wider group. What's more interesting than that is the way that foreign actors have exploited those extremisms for their own ends. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, to an extent, yeah, definitely. The way in which the undercurrent has been brought to the fore and enabled. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about an enabling that's happening. And there's no way we can get around that. And I think to bring it to the contemporary, not to go too far away from Syria, but a contemporary example is in how Lieutenant General Michael Flynn was grumbling about the Obama policy to support jihadists. That's the long and short of it in the region. And it basically enabled either through commission or omission, right, the IS, the Islamic State, to rise in Iraq and struggle in, of course, Syria, and engage in those two crucibles. Now, what I'm saying is that there's an active the peeling the veneer, peeling the kind of the veneer. The question is, it's a policy decision that Obama made, and that policy decision, of course, General Flynn's been exonerated. There's been a lot of mudslinging on his name. If you kind of take the time to look behind the reasons why he was vindicated, you'll see that he was grumbling against the Obama administration's policy decision at the time when IS was rising. Now, my point is that policy decision was somewhat beneficial to the wider policy, the policy decisions to destabilize Syria, to Assad must go, right? Get Assad out, right? Because he was obviously one of the last remaining people who did not fall in line with the NATO plans for the region, and so again we're seeing the use of non-state actors to destabilize the state, right? And it kind of feeds into the benefit of Israel, NATO, and of course the major players in NATO, the US and UK.
Do you think
the France?
I wonder, does anyone have an answer to Oz's question, which I think was your implied question, Oz, that is there more, though, that the Arab states or major Arab entities, if you like, in the region, that is there more that they could have done to have resisted this these foreign interests, but in a kind of sustainable way, and in a sustainable way and an effective way, and in a way that also respected maybe and this is one of the ways that it would be sustainable, I would argue as well, of course, is that by allowing a greater amount of democracy at home. And I think, I just want to reply to that little comment you made earlier, Zoe, which I thought was interesting, that you said that when people are seduced by these romantic ideals, I would argue that the people who commit these excesses to account are often those who also cling to some quite romantic ideals. So I don't think idealism is necessarily itself the problem. It's when people have the wrong ideals or the wrong interests, when they're looking out for their self-interest rather than the benefit of their their community, their culture, their country, whatever. Yeah.
Well, I guess the reason I mentioned the issue about if we are responsible in some way, so from what Ziriad is suggesting, it's that what we're going through is not unique. All civilizations go through different moments of peace and different moments of turbulence. The Europeans have gone through what we're going through right now, right? But the question then is, if a civilization has gone through this instability in the past, now we have the benefit of history to learn what they did wrong and what they did right, and to apply that knowledge. Why aren't we doing that? Do you see what I'm saying? Because like, it seems to me like our own exceptionalism as Arabs shoots us in the foot. We think we're politically, religiously, ideologically, all these things unique, but really we're not. We're not. A lot of these dynamics are just repeat dynamics, and they're just mechanisms of, that's how political science works, you know? It's just a mechanism.
So how would you answer your own question then, Oz? Like, why do you think there is that susceptibility, or why do you think that these things occur today in 2020?
I think I agree with you that one of the main reasons why instability has occurred is because of division. But I think there's another layer as well, which is it's because of unsettled disputes. I think there were a lot of disputes that were ignited during the colonial period that were ignored or unresolved, consciously or otherwise, when the colonizers decolonized the region. For example, the Western Sahara issue between Morocco and Algeria, the Kurdish question.
Or the Alawites in Syria, see how they were the favored of the French.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, but maybe that's the bit that is unique, that we can't learn the lessons from history, because obviously Europeans didn't go through this. It's not like Genghis Khan like left an unresolved issue, a major unresolved issue in Russia or something that we can refer to and like work around. So yeah, maybe it's the role of colonialism that is the new thing, and we're the guinea pigs in this situation.
I think the problem with Europe, the benefit that Europe had when it was going through these turbulent times and these revolutions, was that it didn't have, because you're right, every society has some kind of unresolved issue, like it has pre-existing sectarianisms or prejudices that serve to destabilize the society in some way, perhaps. But we had the benefit, you could argue, of not having foreign empires or powers that were significantly stronger than us and could use European instability to their, like these pre-existing instability and kind of instabilities, and apply like an order of magnitude onto them in terms of making them so much harder for the people actually living there to handle and to process these issues, because there are people who are taking these problems abroad and exploiting them for their own ends, right? Because at least while Europe was going through these problems, you could say it was the most powerful, it was the great power of the world at the time. While the Arab world is very rich in natural resources and various other things, that I think it's just, unfortunately, the worst side of human nature, that if you see someone's fighting, if you see your neighbor squabbling in his garden and you see him drop, I'm going to use a very crude analogy here, but if people are fighting over their land and you see things get dropped on the side, you'll pick them up. Like people, they'll take advantage of instability to carve out their own little piece. And that itself can cause a lot more instability and then cause them to get even wealthier. And I don't think they have the NATO powers, Israel, these countries have an interest in West Asian stability. They have a very clear interest in its instability.
Exactly, I agree. And I think another issue that we have is there's a fear of expert and expertise. So I wouldn't describe myself as an expert, especially when I first came out of university. I was a complete novice at this. But one thing that I remember really clearly is when I graduated, I applied for like a foreign office role in Morocco, and they rejected me on the basis of having dual nationality. And they said that it's against procedure to have an individual with dual nationality because it presents a conflict of interest. Then I had conversation with someone at the British Foreign Office, and they said to me that actually this dual nationality thing is not true. It's a load of rubbish. Like that isn't there. There's no legal grounding to reject someone on the basis of having a dual nationality. So the impression I got from that is that a lot of Arab governments don't like people that have studied outside, or they don't like subject matter experts, like to have a scientist in their nuclear team or to have an engineer in their infrastructure team or whatever, because it might expose some inefficiencies or corruption within their own government, right? So what I'm trying to say is domestic governments think that having experts in their government will undermine them. But in the case of Syria, maybe they needed more astute policymakers and academics. Maybe that would have protected Syria in the long term if they had a policy of embedding experts in their team 20 years ago under Hafiz al-Assad. Maybe that would have protected the country into the future from instability. Do you see what I'm saying? So yeah, I think this is an issue.
I get what you're saying. I think it's a very important point that you made about the grievances that are not addressed and are their baggage from the colonial era. That's a very important thread, and I think that is weaponized. It's been weaponized, and unfortunately, what the reality is that we are living in the media age, and so these issues are amplified somewhat. Now, when you look at the state formation project in Europe, when you're looking at the Romantic era, when you're looking at the late 1800s, and you're looking at the formation of these nation states, as we know them today, there was a lot of blood and carnage that was associated with it. A lot of people were killed, a lot of people were marginalized, a lot of people were slain for the flag and for the good of the nation. So I think what I'm saying is that it's just a question of focus. Today, this is in the news. It's in the news cycle 24/7, and that amplifies these issues like of these underlying issues, right? And what my point is that the formation of a state is never an easy process, and so the kind of the criticisms, and I think this is perhaps where we might want to go in that conversation. The criticisms that's leveled against the Syrian government for its approach against the revolution is kind of, it's almost schizophrenic. Like when I speak to people who are anti-Assad and are very much like criticizing Assad, and their point is that, oh, they'll use the examples of barrel bombs and chemical attacks and so on and so forth. But then my issue is and then in the same breath, praise the fact that they're living in a Western liberal democracy, which I find to be somewhat schizophrenic. And I'll explain why. What I mean by that is, look, violence and the state are in a marriage, and they're not going to be divorced anytime soon. The use of violence by state structures or state actors is an age-old tale from the beginning, from the Treaty of Westphalia. In fact, that's why the Westphalia kind of even occurred, was to kind of prevent the long wars that were occurring, between these princely states. But my point is, not to go off on too much of a tangent, is the use of force by, say, the US or the UK is seen to be within the strictures of the international community, and of course they try to get legitimacy through the international body, right? but what I'm saying is, and these people I speak to are realists, they're self-described realists. If you are a self-described realist, then you should really, like, I don't see what your contention or problem is with a state, a quote-unquote rogue state, using force against a section of the population that is seeking to overthrow it.
Yeah, I think Zaria makes a very important point about how the quote-unquote liberal states of the West have just become very efficient. And, I've argued this for years, that there is corruption here, there's violence here. They've just become better at hiding it or distancing it, because the frontiers of Western power or British power or US power or Israeli power, whatever, although you can say with Israeli power, it's actually very close to home. But with us, the frontiers of our power are nowhere near as close to home. There is the frontier of our sphere of influence as a British state are further away. They're in some distant country where we are waging a proxy war, but they aren't on our own doorsteps. These struggles, the struggles of our state, which is, yeah, I agree, states are inherently violent. It's how they legitimize and perpetuate themselves. But the struggle then has to lie in, if you're going to take a principled stand against, and I think a lot of our previous conversations have touched on this, maybe it is what it boils down to a lot of the time. If you're going to take a principled stance against one dictator, you have to make sure you're principled across the board. Like you on, or if people catch you out on it, then they are right to catch you out on it, your hypocrisy or your selective blindness or deafness. Like if you have to call out violence wherever you see it, or just see the bigger picture, perhaps. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess look, my position on this is clear. I am against Bashar al-Assad in the same way that I'm against Gaddafi. But what I don't like is the way we deal with it and the way we manage the situation in a way that basically exacerbates civil war, A, and B, that plays into power for foreign power interests that could undermine our stability going into the future. So it's more the methodology that I take qualm with. I have a problem with
that. I think you can touch up or bring into the conversation the use of proxies, and not non-state actors, but local state actors like Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, because these are the conduit through which the Syrian war has occurred.
Mm. Yeah, agreed. I think, yeah, that I definitely agree that there is a regional power battle between specifically between Saudi, Qatar, and Iran right now. Definitely.
Oz, how do you think, because I think this will go back to your earlier question, in terms of to what extent the Arab world might be culpable, if you agree that the way of severing that Western military industrial complex's influence in the region is by removing its proxies, because I don't think the illusion of them being liberal democracies could survive any more heavy-handed interventions. I think we've seen more and more that their reliance on proxies. And if we were to somehow remove these proxies, or the ability of the West to use these powers proxies, I mean, what is the best way of doing that? If maybe that's where we should take it. If people in Syria or across the Arab world want to challenge the complicity of their own government, or on either side of this, obviously we're not going to talk about Assad in this case, because we've talked about his problems, but if you're on the side of the rebels and you have Western support, but you know that the rebel forces that you support are themselves guilty of war crimes, and how do the Arab people go about holding all these different people to account? It seems like a really difficult question when you're in the middle of a conflict, trying to hold one party in this conflict to account, let alone all parties to a conflict to account. Seems an almost impossible task.
You can't, because
let me just add to that, Oz, before you jump in, because I want you to jump in on this point. Right now, we're seeing a struggle between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Of course, just recently there was an agreement, or UAE and Turkey, perhaps more kind of pertinent, insofar as the UAE trying to establish itself as the preeminent regional power. Most recently, the Middle East, I think, published a report where it kind of reported that Mohammed bin Zayed, Crown Prince of Dubai, had sent over about $3 billion to Assad and was imploring him to kind of restart the offensive in the Idlib region. And of course we can bring Libya into the equation, but what I'm saying is, if you kind of take a closer look at the contemporary affairs, at one point Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia and Turkey were all united in getting rid of Assad, but then it seemed as though the UAE broke ranks, so to speak, and are now more inclined to dealing with Assad, right? I don't know if that's to do with the realities on the ground, or whether it's to do with an ideological stance that they've kind of updated, given the realities on the ground. Just wanted your take on that.
Okay, when did this change? When did this shift happen? Was it this year or the last year?
Yeah, if you look in the Middle East Eye, I think there's a report. It's entitled. One second. Just pulling it up. Exclusive. Mohammed bin Zayed pushed Assad to break Idlib ceasefire, even after Shogu's visit. So a bit of background is basically, obviously Russia and Turkey signed a ceasefire agreement earlier in March this year. And the kind of agreement obviously was the de-escalation zone and the kind of, de-escalation zone and the slow withdrawal of the militant groups. But it seems as though the UAE is taking a stance that no, they should restart the offensive, and they've funded Assad to the tune of 3 billion towards that end, despite, this is interesting, that Russia was against the breaking of the ceasefire. Apparently, according to a report, Putin sent Shogu, the top military man over there, to Damascus to relay the message that no, we want the ceasefire to stay, and when they don't want to restart the tension, which is interesting again because for a long time the framing of the narrative is that it's Assad and Russia and Putin versus the Arab people, right? But here we're seeing an Arab supporting another Arab against other Arabs, kind of thing, if that makes sense. And then you've got Russia on the outside saying, no, stop, you shouldn't do that.
I think I reckon this is linked to UAE repositioning itself against Israel, because I know recently there's been a policy shift from the UAE towards Israel, and I understand they're taking quite a firmer approach. So it seems to me that their backing of Assad could be part of that same policy to be firmer on Israel. That's the impression I get.
Interesting. And you think that's for optics, or do you think that's a deep conviction that they have?
It's difficult. I'm not sure because UAE show, from my opinion, it'll be interesting to yours, but from my opinion, they show conflicting attitudes in the sense that some of their geopolitical moves are quite superficial. It's about building the tallest building or breaking some stupid superficial record in order to get noticed. But then they have other things that are quite deep and profound, like their subsidization of arts and culture and trying to build new museums in the country. So you can see that UAE are driven by values-based politics, but it's not clear if their policy towards Israel is values-based or if it's just about power, or a bit of both. I can't tell that.
Interesting, because you bring up the important point of soft power and use of soft power by any cultural the cultural aspect. It's interesting to note that the museums are built on the back of slave labor, essentially. The backs of these Indian migrants, Bangladeshi migrants, Southeast Asian migrants, right, who are ultimately sometimes they're stateless or effectively stateless. And so the use of soft power is like, on the one hand, it's cultural. It's like building this era. They even did a link up with the Louvre Museum, like a regional one in But of course, it was built on the back of slave labor, and Qatar is just as implicated in this kind of crime. So what I'm saying is, I personally don't think they are principled in any way, shape, or form, and they are exhibiting very Machiavellian type of politics, and a lot of skullduggery is going on. So I don't think their stance is principled, and I think we can see that in Yemen and even in Libya, where UAE and Russia are united, right, in backing Haftar against Turkey and the GNA. So, yeah.
Also, I want you to expand on what you said earlier to my earlier question about whether it's would ever be possible for the Arab world or Arab people to hold both sides on these in these proxy conflicts to account simultaneously, and to have a kind of coherently and genuinely kind of people-powered solution, like a genuine indigenous organic kind of social movement or mass movement for greater democracy, transparency, however you want to put it. I don't know.
Yeah, fine. So basically, one of the problems with branding-based politics, but what I mean by this is like the way that the US or the UK would justify their neo-imperialism by stating that they're trying to spread democracy or they're trying to spread this or that. One of the problems with this kind of politics is that no nation and no individual is free from any immoral behavior. So if that becomes exposed, then you undermine your own politics and your own agenda. Now, when it comes to Arab revolutions like Syria and Libya and so forth, everybody in a civil war is going to have some blood on their hands, right? Now, what happens is, as you know, common sense dictates that the victor writes the history. So whoever wins that battle will hold everyone else accountable except for themselves. And the reason that they do that is because if they do hold themselves accountable, they're going to inevitably unravel immoral actions that have happened at the hands of rebel forces or whatever it is. And then you're going to enter what Ziria spoke about last week or the week before. We have this infinite regress of revolutions because the other group think that they're morally superior to someone else. So basically, the point is this: in order to stop this continuous cycle of revolution, someone needs to win the war and someone needs to make themselves immune from accountability at the end of that war. That's just how it works.
Not necessarily. You could say the person who, a hallmark of a more stable or democratic state could be that they can tolerate that a certain amount of criticism, and there is rule of law is kind of more becomes more of an actuality rather than just a principle. I don't think there's truly rule of law anywhere where you hold everyone equally accountable for the same crime, but you see it more possibly in some places than others. And where you could get out of that cycle is by, once the person wins, is to not immediately then to try and annihilate their opposition. That the future is in dialogue, and where you allow that kind of genuine pluralism, like that you'll defeat your enemy, not completely annihilate them, and then allow them to participate in kind of the future dialogue within that country or within that polity.
Yes. So I think the key phrase that you used there was a certain amount of accountability. So for example, a lot of countries do this where they start to do accountability in stages to not rock the boat too much. So Britain is a good example of this, right? Like the Iraq War, 10 years later, whatever, then there was a Chilcot inquiry. In 20 years' time, then somebody will be put into prison or be ruled posthumously guilty of a war crime, right?